Back again for Poetry Lockdown. We're up to day 103. Today we have a double feature. Tiana Clark, contemporary poet, young poet, um, and really in conversation with a poet from the 18th century, Phillis Wheatley. Really excited. I'm going to sample both those poems, so it might be a little longer, maybe like 8 or 9 minutes. Who knows? We'll get into it in a minute. Before diving in, I just want to note this is definitely a theme that I'm trying to pursue as a poet, as a reader of poetry. Just this question of conversing, especially with one's poetic influences and elders. So we had that terrific Aracelis Germai essay that I mentioned that was in conversation with the Gwendoline Brooks poem. Earlier we had I've read some Baldwin, some of his essays, and then talked about how Nikki Giovanni has been influenced by him, is in conversation with him, through the years. And then there's classic Auden and Yeats. Auden's definitely in conversation with Yeats through some of his most famous poems. But what about today? We're talking Wheatley and Tiana Clark. So Phillis Wheatley, definitely a poet who I remember reading in high school, is always anthologized, the way I think she's usually taught, or at least the way she was in my American literature textbook, is, the first African American author. She was sold into slavery, I think, at age 7 or 8, and published a book and then won her freedom. Definitely was not respected. I don't think in the same way as white authors were in her time period. There's a really infamous quote from Thomas Jefferson, really kind of slandering or slighting her poetry. But Tiana Clark is really, her work is in some ways like letters to the poet. So I want to read first one of Phillis Wheatley's most famous poems, and then read this contemporary poet's really response to the poem, and then the conversation poem that follows it. So let's start with Phillis Wheatley. So this famous poem, if you took a high school English American literature course, you might have read it. On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phillis Wheatley. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Saviour too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negros, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So that's Phillis Wheatley. And now let me read from Tiana Clark, who's got this really, just for me, opens that poem up. And she says in her commentary on this classic Wheatley poem from the 18th century, she says about that last line, remember, she, Wheatley, never had a black audience. So the address here is to white Christians. Remember, I'll be riding that heavenly train with you too, boo. My paraphrase, the poet says. Remember, a dinaton, all these impossible circumstances, a sickly child slave named after her slave ship, John and Susanna Wheatley losing a child recently before buying little Phyllis. So a tenderness is there, teaching her Alexander Pope and Jesus strung together for my survival. And just as kind of a gloss, that phrase "adinaton" comes up a couple of times in this essay by Clark, and she glosses it as, I'm just learning new things here. It has to do with a figure of speech in the form of hyperbole taken to such extreme lengths as to insinuate a complete impossibility. So you'll see that again at Dinaton and one of these other parts I'll quote. But now let's look at the poem that Tiana Clark wrote in response, right? And it's Conversation with Phillis Wheatley #2. And the first line of the poem is the poet, or speaker of the poem, I should say, imagining Phillis Wheatley asking her this question. So you should, when you see that first line, that's really Clark imagining Wheatley saying this. Tell me about your baptism?" she asked. I rose out of the water, a caught fish, slippery, gaping for breath, brand new with righteousness. I walked down to the frothing whirlpool. Pastor Lonnie, a white man in a white robe, extended his hands and helped me down the steps. The congregation watched as I answered his questions. Yes, yes, yes. Jacuzzi-warm water gurgled and spun as his white robe spread around my little circumference. Holy creamer. He put his hand on my nose, pinched my breath. I did not close my eyes as he buried me under the water. Under the water, I heard muffled shouting. Under the water, I saw Pastor Lonnie's face ripple in thirds. He tipped my body back, lifted me up and out from the wet coffin to the deafening resound of clapping and yelling from the church. My hair back to curls, my face like the face of my birth when I was cut from my mother, terrified, ready to scream. Wow. There's a baptism poem for you, right? I've talked a lot about in this sort of poetry lockdown series about poems that I really respond to are poems that make the familiar strange, and as a Catholic, seeing babies baptized, I'm almost falling asleep at church when it's happening, to be honest, like, oh, cute, nice. This is the opposite of that. This is a terrifying moment. And right, when you kind of layer onto it African-American experience and those lines about breath, it becomes even more charged with meaning. And I want to close this out by reading Tiana Clark's reflection on her own poem, right? So she says, in closing out this essay, I want to make sure I find the right spot. Thanks for your patience. I often feel impossible in my body when I walk on the street, clutching my breath, thinking of Nia Wilson, right, who was murdered in 2018 on the BART in San Francisco. And I'll be clutching my breath when you read this. I come from a long line of breath clutchers, single black mothers that have prayed for my possibleness on their knees, thick with ash and hard work, Adinaton. The extreme hyperbole of black persistence and poetry, which is the ultimate organization of our collective held and spent breath. In the last known letter that Wheatley writes to Ober Tanner, she says, quote, I hope, and Ober Tanner is another black woman in the 18th century that Wheatley's writing to. She says, quote, I hope our correspondence will revive and revive in better times. Pray, write me soon, for I long to hear from you. I am responding to that urgent plea in my poems, Tiana Clark says. I am trying to answer that longing by suspending time. A poem can attempt to answer a series of unanswerable griefs in verse. I love that. I'm going to close with that line. A poem can attempt to answer a series of unanswerable griefs in verse. That seems like an Adinaton, but it's one that I'm so glad Tiana Clark has attempted. So thank you for your poem, Tiana Clark, and thank you all for listening.